The sun was beginning to set behind the tall oak trees surrounding the massive mansion in Atlanta, Georgia. Richard Lawson, the billionaire owner of Lawson Tech Enterprises, had been away on business for the last 2 weeks. His life was a whirlwind of meetings, deals, and endless work, but today he had decided to return home early, unannounced. He had made this decision on a whim. Something about the silence on the phone with his assistant, something about missing his kids made him want to be there. As his sleek black car rolled down the long driveway toward his estate, Richard's thoughts were filled with the usual: company problems, finances, and keeping up appearances. But the moment his car came to a stop in front of the mansion, something felt off. The house, usually bustling with energy, was eerily quiet. No sound of his triplets, Noah, Malik, and Jamari, laughing or running around. No sound of the maids cleaning or his housekeeper fussing in the kitchen. It was almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. Richard stepped out of the car, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the pavement as he walked toward the front door. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he certainly didn't expect what he saw when he opened the door. There, in the grand foyer of his mansion, were his 3 sons. But they weren't alone. Clara, the maid who had only been working for them for about a month, was kneeling in front of them. Her hands were gently holding theirs as she whispered something softly. The triplets' heads were bowed, their small hands clasped in prayer. Richard stood frozen at the door, watching in complete silence. "Clara," Richard muttered, his voice full of confusion. Clara looked up, her expression unreadable. She wasn't startled. She had clearly expected him. But she wasn't expecting the rage and disbelief that flickered in Richard's eyes. "Mr. Lawson," she said softly, standing up and brushing her hands together. She didn't seem nervous, but there was something about her calm demeanor that made Richard's heart pound harder. The triplets, no longer focused on their prayer, turned their heads and stared at their father. Their eyes were wide, unsure of how to react. "Dad, we were just praying," Noah said quietly, as if trying to explain himself. His small voice shook. Richard took a step forward, his eyes scanning the scene. It was like a bad dream, a situation he couldn't comprehend. He'd never seen his children so calm, so peaceful. "Why?" Richard finally choked out, the word hanging in the air. "Mr. Lawson, I've been teaching them how to pray. I thought it might help them," Clara said, her voice steady but soft. The words hit Richard like a punch. His mind raced, trying to catch up with the situation unfolding in front of him. What was going on? How had this woman, a complete stranger just 2 weeks ago, gotten his sons to pray? And why hadn't they told him? His anger rose quickly, but so did a strange, uncomfortable feeling. Was this what they needed all along? He'd been so caught up in his empire that he hadn't even noticed his children slipping away from him. "Clara, I didn't hire you to be a teacher. You were hired to clean, to take care of the house, not to—" "I'm sorry." "Mr. Lawson," Clara interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "But you've been so busy." They needed someone. Richard froze. She was right. He had been so busy, so wrapped up in his business and his own grief after his wife passed away, that he hadn't even realized what his children were going through. They weren't just acting out like he thought. They were lost. But still, this wasn't how he imagined finding them praying, talking about their feelings, opening up to someone who wasn't him. Richard's eyes shot to his sons, and then back to Clara. "What's going on here? What's going on with my kids, Clara?" His voice was low, full of tension. Clara swallowed hard, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her apron. "They've been hurting, Mr. Lawson. They miss their mom, and they miss you, too. I just wanted to help them." Richard's heart sank. His mind reeled. How had he failed his sons like this? How had he missed everything? He had been so consumed by his work that he didn't even see the pain in his own children's eyes. "What else don't I know?" Richard asked, his voice shaky. Clara didn't answer immediately. She looked at the floor, taking a deep breath. And then, as if this was the hardest thing she'd ever said, she whispered, "Your sons have been praying for you, Mr. Lawson. They've been asking God to bring their father back to them, ... the way he used to be." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. How had he let it go this far? The silence in the room was deafening. For the first time, Richard Lawson, CEO, billionaire, and owner of an empire, didn't know what to say. Then Jamari, the youngest of the triplets, broke the silence with a simple question. "Dad, will you stay this time?" Richard blinked, his heart shattering at the sincerity in his son's voice. He couldn't answer, not right away. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. But that was the question, wasn't it? Would he stay? He glanced at Clara, whose quiet presence had somehow become a lifeline for his children. He looked back at his sons, their faces filled with hope. And in that moment Richard knew that his life was about to change. But the question was, could he handle what came next? The days that followed were strange, full of small adjustments that Richard wasn't sure how to make. He had promised his sons that he would be there for them, but the weight of his old habits, the business, the meetings, the ceaseless pressure of running his empire pulled at him constantly. Yet as the days passed, he found himself waking up earlier, lingering at the breakfast table, and staying home more. It felt like he was fighting an uphill battle, trying to juggle the demands of his company and the responsibility of being a father. But every time he looked at his children, he knew it was worth the fight. Clara had become a steady presence in the house, not just as a maid, but as someone who had woven herself into the fabric of their lives. She was quiet, patient, and incredibly thoughtful. The triplets, once angry and closed off, now seemed to trust her in a way they hadn't trusted anyone in years. They followed her around like little shadows, asking questions, sharing their worries, and, for the first time in a long while, laughing again. But Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Clara than he realized. He had tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to his own guilt and uncertainty. But now something kept tugging at him. One evening, as he sat alone in his study, papers scattered across the desk, the door creaked open. Richard didn't need to look up to know who it was. Clara stood in the doorway, her presence calm and grounded. She wasn't there to disturb him, but somehow Richard had come to rely on her quiet strength. "Do you need something?" Richard asked, his voice distracted, his mind still lingering on work. "I wanted to check in," Clara said, her voice soft but sincere. "How are you holding up?" Richard paused. The question wasn't just a casual one, it was genuine. Clara had been watching him, observing the way he struggled with his new role as a father. She could see what he was going through, but she wasn't pushing him. "I'm trying," Richard admitted, running a hand through his hair. "It's harder than I thought, Clara. I thought I could just fix things. But I can't. It's not that simple." She stepped into the room, closing the door quietly behind her. "No one expects you to fix everything, Richard. All you have to do is show up. You're already doing that." Richard sighed, his mind drifting to the company, the board, the pressure. "But showing up isn't enough. I have to make it right. I have to ... I can't let them down again." Clara's eyes softened. "You've already made the first step. You're here. That's what matters." She paused before continuing, her voice barely above a whisper. "But sometimes showing up means more than just being physically present. It means letting go of the things that are holding you back." Richard frowned, confusion written across his face. "What do you mean by that?" Clara glanced at the window, watching the evening light filter in. "I think you're still holding on to something. Something you don't want to let go of." Richard looked away. He didn't want to admit it, didn't want to face it. But he knew she was right. It wasn't just his company he was clinging to, it was his grief. He had buried it deep, never allowing himself to truly grieve Catherine's death. And now it was choking him. "I don't know how to let go," Richard murmured, almost to himself. Clara sat across from him, her gaze steady. "It's not about forgetting. It's about finding a way to live with it, finding a way to heal." Richard swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. "I don't know how to do that." There was a long silence, and then Clara spoke again, her voice soft but carrying a weight of its own. "Maybe it's time you talk to the boys. They need to know that you're not just here physically, but emotionally too." Richard's chest tightened. Talking to his sons, that was the one thing he had avoided. He didn't know how to face them, to admit that he had failed them. "They'll never understand," Richard muttered. "How could they?" Clara leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. "They already understand more than you think. They just need to hear it from you." The truth in her words hit him harder than he expected. Clara wasn't just telling him to be a father. She was telling him to be honest, to stop pretending. Richard looked down at his hands, his mind racing. Could he do it? Could he tell his sons that he was broken, that he wasn't perfect, that he was still struggling? Could he be vulnerable in front of them after all these years of hiding behind his wealth and power? He didn't have an answer, not yet. But as he looked up at Clara, something shifted inside him. She was right. He couldn't keep running. Not from his children, not from the past. "Thank you," Richard said quietly. I needed to hear that." Clara gave him a small, knowing smile. "Any time, Richard. I'm here." As she turned to leave, Richard's mind was swirling with thoughts and questions. He was a man of action, a man who prided himself on solving problems. But this wasn't a problem he could fix with money or power. This was something deeper, something he couldn't control. Richard didn't know what would happen next. But he knew one thing for sure: he had to face the truth, both for himself and for his children. And maybe, just maybe, that would be the key to healing. The next morning, Richard sat down with the Triplets for breakfast, ready to have the conversation that had been weighing on him for so long. But as he opened his mouth to speak, a knock on the door interrupted him. It was an unexpected visitor, a man Richard hadn't seen in years. What did this man want? And how would his appearance change everything? The knock on the door came just as Richard was about to speak, his mouth already parted to call his sons to the table. He hesitated, the words stuck in his throat. The sound of the knock echoed through the hallway, sharp and insistent, almost as if it were demanding attention. Clara, who had been quietly setting the table, turned towards the door with a furrowed brow. Richard's eyes followed hers, his stomach tightening. No one else was expected. His assistant had already confirmed his schedule for the day, and no one from the company ever showed up unannounced. "Who is it?" Richard called, his voice tinged with irritation as he walked toward the door. The weight of the conversation with his children, something he wasn't ready for, felt heavier with every passing second. The butler opened the door before Richard could reach it, his face pale. "Mr. Lawson, there's someone here to see you. He insists on speaking with you right away." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Who?" "His name is Marcus Johnson, sir," the butler said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He says you'll remember him." Marcus Johnson? The name sounded familiar, but Richard couldn't place it. He didn't have time for ghosts from the past, not today. Not when everything felt like it was finally starting to come together with his family. "Send him away," Richard said, irritation rising. But before he could finish his sentence, the door opened wider. A tall man stepped inside. His suit was immaculate, but his presence was anything but polished. His eyes were intense, like a storm behind a calm exterior, and when he spoke his voice rang with a familiarity that made Richard's pulse race. "Hello, Richard," Marcus Johnson said, his smile sharp. "It's been a while." Richard froze. The man standing before him was no stranger. Marcus Johnson had been part of Richard's life years ago, back when the world seemed more certain, back when Richard's empire was just beginning to rise. Marcus had been an old friend, a business partner, but Richard hadn't heard from him in years. They'd parted ways after some disagreement, a falling out that had never been fully resolved. Richard's memories of Marcus were clouded by bitterness and regret. "What are you doing here?" Richard asked, his voice tight with a mixture of shock and frustration. Marcus took a step forward, glancing briefly at the triplets, who were now standing behind Richard, unsure of who this man was. Their curiosity and suspicion mirrored Richard's own. "I need to talk to you, Richard," Marcus said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, "about something important." "About the triplets?" Richard's heart skipped a beat. The triplets? He hadn't seen Marcus in years, yet here he was, showing up unannounced and talking about his children. "You don't get to just waltz back into my life like this, Marcus," Richard said, his voice sharp, the anger rising. "What do you want?" "I told you before, we're done." Marcus's face hardened. "No, Richard, we're not done. And I never forgot about the triplets. The truth is, I've been looking for you for a while. I need to warn you about something." The words hung in the air, heavy and cryptic. Richard couldn't breathe. He hadn't been expecting this. A part of him wanted to shut the door and tell Marcus to leave, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. "A warning?" Richard echoed. "What warning?" Marcus looked at Clara, who was standing just behind the boys. "It's about your children, Richard, about their mother, about everything you thought you knew." The room fell silent. Richard's heart pounded in his chest. What was Marcus talking about? He hadn't heard anything about his children's mother since the accident. He turned to Clara, confusion clouding his thoughts. She was still, her face unreadable. "What does he mean by that?" Richard asked, looking at her for the first time that morning with a new sense of urgency. Clara remained quiet, her gaze soft but distant. "I don't know," she whispered, but Richard could see the flicker of worry in her eyes. "Please just tell me what this is all about. Richard said, his voice strained. Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes darkening. Richard, your wife's death wasn't an accident. The words struck Richard like a physical blow. His entire world tilted on its axis. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he couldn't process what Marcus had just said. No, Richard said, shaking his head, disbelief clouding his features. No, that's not possible. It was a car crash. A drunk driver. I saw the reports. I've known the truth. Marcus stepped closer, his voice lowering to a near whisper. You don't know everything, Richard. You never did. The truth is more complicated than that. Your wife wasn't just a victim in that crash. She was caught up in something much bigger. Richard's mind raced. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or was Marcus telling him something he didn't want to hear? He looked at his sons, who were now standing wide-eyed, completely unaware of the gravity of the conversation unfolding in front of them. The silence in the room was suffocating. I'm going to need you to explain yourself, Marcus, Richard said, his voice steady but full of fear. I will, Marcus replied. But first I need to tell you something about Clara. Richard's eyes snapped to Clara, who looked almost startled, as though she had been caught in a web she hadn't intended to enter. What about Clara? Richard asked, his voice trembling slightly now. Marcus looked at Clara, then back to Richard. Clara isn't just a maid. She's been keeping secrets from you. From all of you. The air in the room shifted. Richard's breath caught, his heart pounding in his chest. What did Marcus mean? What had Clara been hiding? Just as Marcus was about to reveal what he knew, Clara spoke. Stop, Marcus. It's time they knew the truth. I'm not who you think I am. The words hung in the air, and for a moment the room was frozen in time. Clara had never been the type to speak with such authority, and Richard could feel the weight of her statement press on him like a suffocating blanket. His mind raced, heart pounding in his chest as he tried to process the sudden shift in the conversation. I'm not who you think I am, Clara repeated, her voice steady, but soft, her eyes meeting Richard's with a look that was almost apologetic. Richard's throat tightened. What do you mean by that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned to Marcus, seeking some kind of confirmation, something that could explain this strange turn of events. Marcus, ever the mysterious figure, remained quiet for a moment, his gaze locked on Clara. You've been keeping this from him, Clara, for all these weeks. You've been lying. Clara's expression didn't falter, but Richard saw a flicker of pain behind her calm demeanor. She took a step forward, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in front of her. Clara, you don't have to do this, Richard said, his voice strained with confusion. You've been here for us. You've been good to my sons. Whatever it is, we'll work through it. But Clara shook her head, tears beginning to well in her eyes. No, Richard. This has to come out. I can't keep hiding from it. It's time. The room was so quiet that Richard could hear the soft breathing of his sons behind him. They were watching, trying to make sense of the tension in the room. But they could see it, the fear in Clara's eyes, the weight of something unspoken that had been buried for far too long. Clara turned to Marcus, her expression softening for a brief moment before she faced Richard once more. I never wanted to tell you this, she began, her voice thick with emotion. But I'm not just a maid you hired. I'm not just some woman who happened to come into your life by chance. She paused, the words heavy with significance. I'm their mother. Richard's heart stopped. The world seemed to tilt beneath him, the ground beneath his feet suddenly unsteady. His gaze snapped to his sons, Noah, Malik, and Jamari, standing behind him, their faces a mixture of confusion and expectation. They had been listening, quietly waiting for the revelation, their small hands clenched at their sides. "No," Richard breathed, his voice barely audible. "What are you saying, Clara? These are my children. You're telling me they're yours?" Clara nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "Yes, Richard. I'm their mother." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I'm so sorry. I know this is the last thing you expected, but I had to leave. I had to get away, and I couldn't take them with me." Richard's knees nearly buckled beneath him. His vision blurred as he tried to make sense of her words. His mind raced through every moment he had spent with Clara in the house, every kind gesture, every small act of care, but none of it made sense. You were their mother this whole time?" he asked, his voice low and disbelieving. Clara nodded again, her expression full of sorrow. "Yes, I never wanted to bring this into their lives. I wanted them to have a chance at a normal life, away from the chaos of our past." Richard's mind was in turmoil, everything he had known about his children and their lives shattering in an instant. "But why, Clara? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you?" "Because I was trying to protect them," Clara interrupted softly. "You were not ready, Richard. You were not in a place where you could handle the truth. And you weren't ready for what I knew about their mother, about everything." She paused, her breath shaky. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you sooner." Richard took a step back, feeling as if the floor beneath him was crumbling. "No, this can't be real. I don't understand. How did you ... How did we not know?" Marcus stepped forward, breaking the silence that had enveloped the room. "It was my doing, Richard. I knew the truth all along. Clara was trying to protect her children, but she couldn't do it on her own. She couldn't tell you because it wasn't safe. There were people in her past who would have hurt them if they knew the truth." Richard's mind was racing, but one question stood out above all the others. Who ... who would hurt them? Marcus's gaze turned somber. "It's not a simple answer, Richard. There's a history here that you don't know. A history that could put your family at risk." Clara looked away, her face filled with regret. "I never wanted this for them. I never wanted to involve you in this. But I couldn't keep running from the truth." Richard turned to his sons, who were standing in the doorway, their small faces filled with worry and confusion. "Are you ... Are you really their mother?" Jamari asked, his voice small, fragile. Clara's heart broke at the sight of the boys, her sons, standing there, caught in the whirlwind of something they had no way of understanding. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft. "I'm your mother. I'll always be your mother, no matter what happens." Noah stepped forward, his face wrinkled in thought. "But why didn't you want us? Why did you leave us?" Tears filled Clara's eyes. "I never stopped wanting you. I never stopped loving you. I had to leave, but I never stopped thinking about you. And I never stopped praying for you." Richard's heart shattered. This wasn't just about secrets. This was about love, sacrifice, and brokenness. And now, with the weight of the truth hanging in the air, Richard had to face what he could never have prepared for. As Richard absorbed Clara's words, a cold realization dawned on him. This wasn't just about secrets kept from him. It was about a family torn apart by forces they couldn't control. And now the danger was real. Who were these people who would hurt his family? And what would happen to the children he thought he knew?